Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. In this video, we're going to review some of the research that has been conducted in the area of occupational fraud and abuse. We're going to talk about four primary researchers. So the first one is Edwin Sutherland. He was the first researcher in this area starting in the 30s. He was really interested in fraud committed by like the elite upper business world executives. And then came Donald Cressy. He was one of Sutherland's students in the 40s and kind of continued on with this work. And he is the one who ultimately developed the fraud triangle. Then we're going to chat about Dr. Stephen Albrecht. Unlike Cressy and Sutherland, he was actually an accountant and kind of had the view that accountants weren't really equipped to deal with complex financial crimes. So he developed something called the fraud scale, which kind of elaborates on the fraud triangle. So you can kind of see how the three of these kind of morphed and built on one another. And then we have Hollinger and Clark. So these guys are a little bit different. They kind of had a little bit of a different conclusion. They found that employees steal primarily as a result of workplace conditions. And they go on to talk about several different workplace conditions. So we're going to talk about the research from each of these individuals as we go through this video. So let's start at the beginning with our first researcher, who is Edwin Sutherland. He's the founder kind of this line of research, and he's the one that coined the term white-collar crime in 1939. Originally, he intended that this definition mean the criminal act of corporations and individuals acting in their corporate capacity. But since that time, it's really kind of morphed to mean almost any financial or economic crime that happens from the mailroom to the boardroom, is what they say. So, however, many believe his greatest contribution, he coined this term white collar crime, but this theory of differential association is really kind of the thing that they think is Sutherland's greatest contribution. It is one of the most widely accepted theories of criminal behavior. And until the 1930s, basically everyone felt that there was really this genetic background of criminology, or that like if you're a criminal, you're a criminal parent, you're going to make criminal babies who are going to grow up to be criminal parents, and they're going to make criminal babies. So before Sutherland's research, that is typically what they thought. So while this argument may seem pretty naive today, it was based largely on the observations of non-white collar offenders, so murderers, rapists, all these really bad people. What they found was there was some biological association there. But Sutherland was able to explain crime's environmental considerations through the theory of differential association. So the theory's basic underlying tenet is that crime is learned, much like we would learn math or English or accounting or any other skill. And that this learning is going to take place by communication between people. So typically we call these intimate personal groups. And this learning explains, in his view, how a dysfunctional parent is more likely to produce dysfunctional kids. So Sutherland believed that the learning process kind of involves two specific areas. So first you have to learn the techniques to commit the crime, and then you have to learn the attitudes or drives or rationalizations and motives of that criminal mind. So you can see how in Sutherland's differential association theory fits with our idea of these occupational offenders. So organizations that have dishonest employees will eventually infect all of your honest employees, and it just will continue, a snowball effect. But it also can go the other way. If we have some honest employees, they will eventually have some positive influences on people who are dishonest. So Donald R. Cressy was one of Sutherland's students during the 1940s. So his research, instead of being kind of at that top elite level, like Sutherland, was more on embezzlers. And through his observations, he was able to develop the fraud triangle. So we've heard about this before, but let's just go over it one more time. So one leg of the fraud triangle is going to represent perceived pressure or a non-shareable financial need. The second leg is perceived opportunity. And then the final leg is rationalization. One of the most important pieces of the fraud triangle is that we have to have all three elements. If one element is missing, then the trust violation couldn't occur or wouldn't occur. So one thing that Cressy noticed was that an employee placed in the position of having to find a way to relieve the pressure, that financial pressure that's bearing down on them, can't simply steal the money. It's crucial that the employee be able to resolve the financial problem in secret. So it has to be this non-shareable secret sort of pressure that we see. So with a non-shareable financial problem, that person is afraid of losing the approval of those around them. So they feel like they're unable to tell other people about their problems or what's going on. So that's this idea of the perceived pressure or that non-shareable financial need. If they can't share the fact that they're under this financial pressure, then it would follow that they would not be able to share the fact that they were resorting to some illegal means to relieve that pressure as well. So to do that, to admit to these problems, would have to admit that there was a problem in the first place. So it's an interesting thing to note that it's not the embezzlement itself that creates the need for the secrecy. It's the circumstances that led up to the embezzlement. So if I'm embezzling because I have a gambling problem, it's the gambling problem that's creating the need for secrecy, not the actual embezzlement. What else do we want to say? So this fraud triangle helps us to explain the nature of a lot of occupational offenders or frauds, but not all of them. We haven't been able to find a silver bullet that can explain everything. So academics have tested this model, but they have found that it doesn't always work 100%. Because there's no one size fits all. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to go through each of the three legs individually. So first we have that perceived non-shareable financial pressure. So the role of this non-shareable financial pressure is important. What's considered non-shareable depends on the person themselves. So in addition to being non-shareable, the problem that drives the fraudster is described as financial, because these are the types of problems that can generally be solved by the theft of cash or other assets. So a person with large gambling debts, for instance, would need cash to pay those debts. Cressy would note, however, that there are some non-financial problems that could also be resolved by misappropriating funds through a violation of trust. So for example, a person who embezzles in order to get revenge for their employee, if they feel like they've been treated unfairly, could use a financial means to solve what is essentially a non-financial problem. So Cressy identified 6 basic categories of non-shareable problems. So the first one is violations of ascribed obligations. What does this mean? This is the mere fact that a person has a trusted position carries with it the implication that they should act in a certain way and they shouldn't be doing some sort of maybe bad stuff. So for example, a CFO may feel that they're expected to avoid gambling because they're in this this, big position. So when the CFO falls into some gambling debt, they feel unable to share the problem with their peers because this would require them to admit that they have a problem in the first place. So they'd have to admit that they've engaged in some dishonorable conduct that lies at the heart of their financial difficulties. So basically, by admitting that they had lost money through gambling, they would also be admitting, at least in their own mind, that they are unworthy of their position. So that's the first of these categories. The next one is problems resulting from personal failure. So the trusted person feels he caused, through some sort of bad judgment, whatever the problem is, and therefore feels personally responsible for it. So he or she would fear the loss of their status, and the individual is afraid to admit to anyone that could alleviate the situation, the fact that they had a problem in the beginning, because it would, they're embarrassed of making their own bad judgment or being stupid, or just kind of having the idea of ego again comes into play here. So if the potential offender has a choice between covering his poor investment choice through a violation of trust or admitting that he's an unsophisticated investor, it's easy to see how a prideful person could choose the trust violation versus just admitting that they're wrong. So that's problems resulting from personal failures. The next one is business reversals. So business reversals are the third type of situation that Cressy has identified as far as our non-shareable financial problems. This category differs from the other two because here the trust violators tend to see their problems as arising from conditions beyond their control. So maybe it's inflation or high interest rates or an economic downturn. So in other words, these problems are caused by this, they're not caused by their own fault. So it's not like I made a bad decision. It's just the economy went to hell in a handbasket. So it's an outside force that's causing this problem. So it's interesting to note that even in situations where the problem is perceived to be out of the trusted person control, the issue of status still plays a big role in that person's decision to keep the problem secret. So the desire to maintain the appearance of a successful business person is a common theme in cases involving business reversal. So even though things went south, I still want people to think that I'm successful and I don't want to be a failure. So that's this third one, business reversals. Then we have physical isolation. So this one's a little different. So this tells us that the trusted person has no one to turn to. So it's not that he is afraid to share his problems, it's that he has no one to share those problems with. So in this case, he's in a situation where he doesn't have access to trusted friends or associates who would be able to help him. He's just completely isolated. Status gaming is the fifth category relating to status. So this is like an extreme version of keeping up with the Joneses. So in this category, offenders are concerned with maintaining their status, not admitting failure, keeping up appearances. But here the offenders are motivated by a desire to improve their status. So it's not just that I want to keep the status quo, but I want to improve my status. So the motive for this type of conduct is often referred to as maybe living beyond their means or having lavish spending. It's not the desire for a better lifestyle that creates the non-shareable problem. We all want to have a better lifestyle, but here it's the inability to obtain these finer things through legitimate means, and an unwillingness to settle for something lower. So we have created that motivation for the trust violation. And then the last one is employer-employee relations. So an employed person who resents his status within the organization where he's trusted, and at the same time feels he has no choice but to continue working for that organization, that resentment can come from perceived economic inequities. Maybe I'm paid less than my boss and I do all of his work, or from feeling overworked or feeling underappreciated. So Cressy said that this problem becomes non-shareable when the person believes that making suggestions to alleviate this perceived maltreatment would threaten his status at the organization. So there's a strong motivator for the perceived employee to want to maybe get even when he feels like he's being ill-treated. So all of these situations deal with some way for status seeking or status maintaining activities by the subjects. In other words, the non-shareable problem threaten the status of the subject or threaten or to prevent them from achieving a higher status than the one that they had previously. And that's kind of the motivation throughout these various categories. Then we have perceived opportunity. So according to the fraud triangle model, the presence of a non-shareable financial problem by itself will not lead an employee to commit fraud. Remember, we have to have all three legs of the triangle. So the key to understanding this theory is to remember that all of those elements have to be present for a trust violation to occur. The non-shareable financial problem creates the motive for the crimes to be committed, but the employee must also perceive that there is an opportunity to commit the crime without being caught. So this perceived opportunity is that second element of the fraud triangle. In Cressy's view, there are two components to perceived opportunity to commit a trust violation. First, we have to have general information, and the second is we have to have some technical skill. So general information is simply the knowledge that the employee's position of trust could be violated. This knowledge might come from hearing of other embezzlements, seeing dishonest behavior by other employees, or just being generally aware of the fact that the employee is in a position where he could take advantage of some of the employer's good faith. So we know that this perceived opportunity typically is going to deal with internal control weaknesses. So first they have to have general information or knowledge that there is this weakness, and then they have to have the technical skill or the ability needed to commit that violation. So these are usually the same abilities that all employees might have. So there could be employees that have general information and technical skill, but they may not necessarily commit the crime. So, these are not unique characteristics of our occupational offenders. Most employees might have these same characteristics, but trusted people that possess the information and the skill when faced with a non-shareable financial problem, they might see it as something that they can use to maybe have power to correct it. So they apply their understanding of the possibility for trust violation to the specific crisis that they might be faced with. Finally, our last side of that fraud triangle is rationalization. So rationalization is a necessary component of the crime before it actually takes place. In fact, it's part of the motivation for the crime. Because the embezzler does not view themselves as a criminal, he has to justify his misdeeds before he can actually commit them. So the rationalization is necessary so that the perpetrator can make his illegal behavior intelligible to him, so he can kind of look at himself in the mirror as this trusted person. So after the crime has taken place, the rationalization will often be abandoned. So this reflects the nature of us all. So the first time we steal money, we might feel really bad about it. It would really bother us. But as that theft becomes repeated, it becomes easier. And one of the hallmark of occupational fraud and abuse offenders is that once the line is crossed, the illegal act becomes more or less continuous and easier for them to do, and they don't feel so bad about it. So when an occupational fraudster might begin stealing with the thought that I'll pay the money back, but after that initial theft is successful, he or she will usually continue to steal past that point of even thinking that it's realistically possible to repay those stolen funds. So Cressy divides subjects or fraudsters into 3 categories. And each of these categories has their own sort of rationalization. So first we have independent businessmen. So independent businessmen are in business for themselves, and they will typically convert money which has been entrusted to them. So they have deposits from their clients or from other people, and they steal those funds. So people in this category tend to be to have 2 common excuses. So first, they're just borrowing the money, or second, the funds entrusted to them were really theirs and you can't steal from yourself. So Cressy found the borrowing rationalization was the most frequently used, and these perpetrators also tend to think everyone in business does this, so therefore it makes it less wrong, and it's okay because everyone's doing it. Then we have long-term violators. So long-term violators converted their employers' funds by taking small amounts over a longer period of time. So similar to the independent businessmen, long-term violators will generally use the borrowing rationalization or something similar to that, like they were embezzling to keep their families from poverty, or in this case, it was a necessity and their employers were cheating them. Their employees were dishonest and they deserved to be fleeced. So something along those lines. So long-term violators usually have a feeling that they would like to eventually repay their debt. So they're thinking, they're using that borrowing mentality, and I'm going to pay this back. When they finally realize that they're in too deep because I've just been stealing for so long and I've taken so much, there comes a point when that embezzler is going to face a crisis. So how can they maintain this borrowing rationalization when they know that they'll never be able to convert it back? So the trust violator is in a position where the level of theft has escalated to a point where they have to have a shift in their thinking. They're going to have a lot of anxiety at this point because they are having a difficult time rationalizing, because how can I steal and still be a good person? So without this the rationalization of borrowing, the long-term offenders find it difficult to reconcile stealing the money. So they kind of have 2 choices when they reach this point. So they can either readopt the attitude of a law-abiding citizen, the same that they identified with at the beginning. And in order to do that, they can either turn themselves in, stop stealing, maybe gamble wildly to try and get the money back to pay off their debts, or they may even commit suicide because they don't feel like there's any way out. Alternatively, instead of readopting the attitude of a law-abiding citizen, they could adopt the attitude of a criminal where this is an okay norm, and then they can continue to steal. The last group that we have is our absconders. So this group of offenders take the money and run. So Cressy found that the non-shareable problem for absconders usually results from physical isolation. So absconders tend to have lower occupational and socioeconomic status than members of the other 2 categories. And because absconders tend to lack strong social ties, Cressy found that almost any financial problem could be defined as non-shareable for these people. And also that rationalizations were easily adopted because these people only had to serve, they only had minimal ties that they had to break in order to run away. So that is our absconders. So then that brings us to Steve Albrecht. So Steve Albrecht, kind of unlike Sutherland and Cressy, he was actually an accountant and realized that accountants were not suited for dealing with complex frauds and occupational crimes. He believed that occupational fraud perpetrators are hard to profile and that fraud is difficult to predict. That's very true. His research included an examination of comprehensive data sources to assemble a complete list of pressure, opportunity, and integrity variables, resulting in a list of 50 possible red flags or indicators of occupational fraud and abuse. So he's kind of taking a deep dive to try and figure out if we can predict when fraud is going to take place. And he identified 50 different things. And these things kind of fell into two categories, all of these different items. So first, he identified perpetrator characteristics. So characteristics of the person doing the bad stuff. And then he also identified organizational environment. So the fraud could be because of things that's going on from the person, or what's going on within that organizational environment. The purpose of his study was to determine which of these red flags were most important to the commission of fraud, and then therefore we could use that information to help with detection and prevention. These red flags ranged from having unusually high personal debts, thinking that your job was in jeopardy, not doing a good background check. So all of these different things were evaluated, but his probably biggest contribution is the fraud scale. So let's take a look at that. So here we have an illustration of the fraud scale. So this includes three components. So we have pressure, opportunity, and then we have personal integrity instead of that rationalization element. So we see on this side, we have higher fraud risk, and on this side, we have lower fraud risk. So when we have high personal integrity, low opportunity, and low pressure, we are less likely to have fraud. When we have low personal integrity, high opportunity, and high pressure, then we have a greater chance of fraud. So we can use this scale to consider our own personal situations and try and see whether we're in a high fraud or a low fraud risk situation. The last person, so the fraud triangle has been elaborated on by several different researchers. So first we have Wolf and Hermanson, and they have added capability. So we have opportunity, rationalization, financial pressure. So the fraud diamond adds this idea of capability. So capability is the ability that the fraudster has to perpetrate and cover up their frauds. So if you have a very skillful fraudster, they would be better suited to committing a fraud than someone with maybe less skill or intelligence. So that's the fraud diamond. Then we have the fraud pentagon. So we still have rationalization, opportunity, pressure. We also have competence that we saw there. And then we also are adding arrogance. So arrogance is similar to ego. So another side here of our fraud pentagon is thinking about how ego may play into the likelihood of committing a fraud. So the last researcher to discuss today is Richard Hollinger and John Clark. So these two researchers reached a different conclusion than Cressy. They found that employees steal primarily as a result of workplace conditions. So they were really investigating what's going on within the workplace that's resulting in fraud. So they also concluded that the true cost of employee theft is vastly understated. Either that's because people aren't getting caught, or we don't really know how much people have caught, or they've been stealing over such a long period of time that we don't actually go all the way back to find out what the true cost is, and that the cost of employee theft is much higher than what we really think it is. So they talked about employee deviance. That's the conduct that's detrimental to the organization and to the employee, and it's caused by job satisfaction. So the employee can either act by stealing or violating social norms. So doing something, employee theft is going to be like the highest level of employee deviance. So thinking about employee deviance and employee theft, they looked at several factors to see what led to employee theft. So the first was income and theft. So under this theory, they're thinking that if you have lower income levels, you're going to have higher levels of theft. However, they were unable to confirm that there was a relationship here. So this would indicate, at least from their study, that income is not a predictor of employee theft. So that one, income and theft, was not supported. The next one, age and theft. This one was supported. So the second theory was that young employers are more likely to commit theft. And there was a direct correlation between age and the level of theft. So young employees are more likely to engage in illegal conduct that runs contrary to organizational and societal expectations. So why might this be? So it's been suggested that younger employees generally are going to have less tenure with their organization, and therefore they're going to have a lower level of commitment. Also, younger employees tend to have less commitment to the idea of conforming to the established social rules and structures, and therefore theft there was that direct correlation between age and theft. Then we have position and theft. So Hollinger and Clark found a direct relationship to the employee's position and the level of theft, with theft being highest in jobs with greater access to the things of value in the organization. That just makes sense. If you have more access, you're going to be more likely. So thefts are highest in jobs with greater access to things of value. They found an obvious connection between opportunity and theft. For example, like a retail cashier with daily access to cash had the highest incidence. So the research believed opportunity to be only a second factor that constrains the manner in which the deviance is manifested. So the research indicated that job satisfaction was the primary motivator of employee theft, and the employee's position only affected the method and the amount of theft after the decision to steal had already been made. After position, they looked at job satisfaction and deviance, and they found that employers who are dissatisfied with their jobs are more likely to participate in counterproductive or illegal behaviors in order to right that perceived inequity. The next one, organizational controls and deviance. So Hollinger and Clark were unable to document a strong relationship between controls and deviance in their research. So they examined 5 different control mechanisms: company policies, selection of personnel, inventory control, security, punishment, and they could not find a strong relationship between those controls and deviance. The last thing that they looked at was the employee perception of control, and they did find that the stronger the perception that the theft would be detected, the less likelihood that the employee would actually engage in that deviant behavior. So therefore, increasing the perception of detection may be one of the best ways to deter employee theft. So that wraps up what I wanted to talk about. I know this one was long. I was originally going to break it up into 2 videos, but I decided just to do one. So sorry about that. So that concludes what I wanted to cover relating to Chapter 2. So make sure you finish your individual assignments and your group assignments for the week. And I look forward to seeing you back here for Chapter 3.